All right. Well, good morning, everybody. We are going to, as I said before, we are going to be jumping into the book of Numbers, continuing with Skip Heitzig. Heitzig? By the way, in case you didn't know, Skip Heitzig, who's from Calvary Chapel, he has a sermon series on this book. So you can check those out. I've listened to it on YouTube. It might be available in other places, but just as a resource, that's additional content. Even if you're like, after listening to me talk for an hour, you're like, I'd like to listen to somebody else talk for an hour about this. I don't know if that's ever the case, but if that is, that's an additional resource that's available to you. I'll give everybody the heads up today. I have not been sleeping well, so I'm gonna, and that's not even on my 6-month-old child. That's just me. That's just me not sleeping well. So it's always an entertaining day, if not for me, but maybe for most people. Whenever I'm tired and we have Bible study, I always walk away like, what even happened? But sure enough, there's somebody. Usually it's Susan, but she's not here with us today. But and she'll be like, "Well, I really got a kick out of that." All right. So we're jumping into the book of Numbers. We know it as the book of Numbers, and that comes from the Latin word numeri, which means numbers. The Greek Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, which would have been very popular at the time of Jesus' life and for the early church, called it arithmoi, which also means numbers or a census. That's where we get our English word arithmetic from. But that wasn't the original name of this. The original name, Bamidbar. Let me double check because my Hebrew, I admit. Bamidbar, yes. So it roughly translates to in the desert or in the wilderness. And the book of Numbers describes both of those things. The book of Numbers describes, first of all, 2 censuses. And there is a census that bookends the entire book. So at the beginning, a census is taken of all of the people who have come out of Egypt. And then at the very end, it has a census that will count all the people who are going to enter into the Promised Land. Now, was the intent for there to be 2 censuses? Probably not the original plan. We'll get into that. But it's not only the censuses and the numbers, but it's also an account of the wandering, the season of trial that the Israelites face in the wilderness as a trial that prepares them to have faith in God to take the land that He has promised to them. All right? There are 3 different sections. So Skip breaks the book of Numbers up into 3 sections. As organization, so let me actually put this on the board. I'm going to get this chair out of here because it's gonna get in my way of pacing. So 3 sections being organization. That's chapters 1 through 4. And then you have disorganization. Chapters 5 through 25, I believe. Yes. Yeah, that's a lot of disorganization. That's a lot of disorganization. But then there is reorganization. And that is chapters 26 to 36. There we go. So, in these 3 sections, you can almost call them 3 acts. I'm a musical theater person, so I always like to think of things in an act structure instead of chapters. Right, you have the first act where everybody's all organized. God gives them instruction on how the camp is going to move, how to set up camp. Also gives them instruction on ritual cleanliness. And then the second act, things always fall apart. The first act is just the setup.
Yeah.
The second act is where everything goes crazy. So disorganization doesn't surprise me as a student of theater or, plays. It seems like the second act of anything that you watch is always a mess. I mean, even any Marvel movie, the second act is when the hero loses the battle, has to recover, get everything together, and then it's like some guy that he met like 40 minutes ago comes out of nowhere and was like, hey, I got the answer. And that's how you get to the conclusion, right? The third act is always everything coming back together for the end. And so there's reorganization that takes place in the third act or the third section of the book of Numbers, where the people are brought back together. They seem to have everything back together. And finally another census is taken, and they end prepared. They end prepared for going into the land that God has promised them. So in the book of Numbers, God establishes cities of refuge. Some of you guys might be following along with us here, and I'm going to try to avoid reading from the book as much as possible. But I got to say, I've really enjoyed looking at this book. I've really enjoyed it. The connections that it makes to the gospel, and even though it's a survey, and a survey is just a brief overlook, we're not getting too deep into every story. We're just going over it, right? When you survey, you're just getting a look of things. So if you send somebody out to survey the land, they're just getting out and they're taking a look, right? They're not turning over every single stone. They're just going out, all right, we've got fields, we've got some trees, some animals maybe, and then they report back on that. So we're getting a survey, but also I love how the author is putting all of these connections and making these connections to different parts of the Bible or different elements that might seem confusing to us. So the book of Numbers, God takes time to establish what are called cities of refuge. Cities of refuge. That's not a concept that we're familiar with. Right? The purpose and the function of cities of refuge was if you killed somebody accidentally, which is, by our law, we call that manslaughter, right? Which does sound a lot worse than murder. Right? Manslaughter sounds... That doesn't sound accidental. In fact, it sounds like a lot of people.
Yeah, it does.
Maybe if you accidentally killed 200 people, that might be manslaughter. But we have our own legal process for that. But the process that God institutes for the Israelites is that if you accidentally kill somebody and you are fearful of justice falling upon you, you could go to a city of refuge. Now, this is only when you accidentally kill somebody. You can't just kill somebody intentionally, with full, you can't premeditated murder somebody in the first degree and then just go to the, city of refuge and neener to everybody. That's not the way it really works. But a city of refuge, the way that it was set up was as long as the high priest was alive, you were safe in the city of refuge. And then when the high priest had passed, you were free to return back to where you came from. Free from worry of any kind of judgment. And I love how the author, Pastor Skip, can I call him Pastor Skip? I'm a little concerned with the name. Whenever I see a name like Heitzig, I'm like, I know I don't want to ask about your grandparents. You can tell I'm really tired. All right, it's just I don't know what the story of Grandpa is when your last name is Heitzig. So I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna get myself in trouble. All right, anyway, this is what we're here for. That, and most importantly, to talk about the Word of God. But the gospel, yes.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Why do you think that this point was brought out? I mean, why?
The cities of refuge?
Right. Why is this notable in this book?
Yeah, well, you have, in the Levitical law, you have all these procedures that are laid out. And the Levitical law is broken up into 3 different sections. Maybe this was covered a little bit. But you have the ceremonial code. you have the moral law, but you have the civic law as well. And the civic law, that part of governance and how everything was to be governed and judgment for different things, it's all regular. So stuff like in the civic law is you need to have a fence over your house. Like on the roof of your house, you need to have a fence there so that if somebody is on your roof that they can't fall off and die. That's just part of it. I love how also God institutes this before they even have houses. Houses are down the line. Because for the entirety of the book of Numbers, they're living a nomadic lifestyle. Right? And admittedly, they live a nomadic lifestyle as a form of their own self-affliction, that they've brought this upon themselves, that they turn an 11-day trip into 38 and a half years of wandering, right? That's in addition to all the time they had already spent in the wilderness outside of Egypt and all the time they had spent at Mount Sinai and receiving the Levitical law. It's just, they take this trip, they get right to the edge, they're almost there. And the book of Numbers could have only been 11 or 12 chapters. Actually, I believe it's chapter 14 where they send out the spies, but we'll get to that in a bit. It could have been a much shorter book. But that's not the way it played out. That's not the way that things played out. And none of it came as a surprise to God, obviously. But these are things that he's instating looking to the future. But what I love about this is the gospel connection of the cities of refuge. Specifically, this idea that when you are guilty of something and fearful of the judgment that would fall on you, you would go to a place of refuge. And while the high priest was living, you were able to safely live there in the refuge of the high priest until he had died, and then you would return back to where you have come from. What I love about this is that with Christ and the gospel, the formula is almost reversed. Right? We who may be fearful of judgment, we don't have to wait for the high priest to die to return and to be free. Right? The high priest has already died to pay for the freedom. And now we live in the refuge that his death has provided for us. And so we can live free of fear or free of condemnation. This is a powerful gospel message, right? It speaks to God's desire for reconciliation of people. Not just reconciliation of people to himself, but reconciliation to one another. Because this person might have, depending on how long a high priest might live, you might only be in a city of refuge for a couple months. Think about that. Maybe if you're there in a city of refuge for 10 years before the high priest passes, people might have, had time to forget or time to move on. But man, if it's only a couple months, that's probably fresh in a lot of people's memory. Their family members are living, right? Their spouses or their children or their parents. But God's call to the people is reconciliation, right? To serve out this time in a place of refuge and then to be free from any fear of revenge, right? Being brought down upon them, because it wouldn't be justice, because God lays out the process for justice. Anything on top of that would be vengeance or revenge. Hopefully that answers your question, right? And these are things that are set up already. And these cities of refuge are placed throughout the nation of Israel. It's not like you have one spot that you can go to. But they're located and spread out across the nation and the promised land.
Similar to our sanctuary cities today.
Yes. Yeah. So we do have sanctuary cities. Yeah. And so although that takes a different connotation, right?
Yes.
I'll hurdle it, right? We'll keep it, but a bit different than the sanctuary cities, right? Because even if it's not like once the mayor of New York is gone, you can just go, to Pennsylvania now. It's a little bit different, but sure, I could see the connection. So the book of Numbers covers almost 40 years that Israel spends wandering in the wilderness. Now, it's about 40 years in total of their time that they spend from leaving Egypt to entering the Promised Land. But this, some scholars place the period between 1445 and 1405 BC. That's just the placement that some historians have put it as far as the timeline goes. I know some people are fascinated with timelines. I'm also one of those people. So Numbers is full of lessons, so the things for us to pick up on as we're moving through the book of Numbers. That faith and unbelief are contagious. This is something that the book of Numbers teaches us. Faith is contagious and can spread. One person with strong faith can impact many, but also one person with whining and grumbling and complaining can impact many. Not even just impact, but can sway many people. And if you're familiar with the story of Numbers, the book is full of whining. The book may as well have been called Wah Wah. You know, it's just, it's a lot of wah wah, it's a lot of whining and grumbling and complaining that takes on, that comes throughout the book. Second, accountability is important to God. Accountability is important to God. The people are held accountable for their unbelief time and time again. And you see plenty of times where God, almost in a way that may sometimes strike us as harsh, brings accountability, checks his people, right? Where they complain and God answers with fire, just bringing fire down among them like, hey, I'm getting your attention. Warning. This is not going to be something that goes well for you. This course of action or this thing that you might fall into is not going to be beneficial to you at all. We're still going. I still see the red light, but all right, we're good. I know. Sometimes I don't know. Oh, okay. I thought Ron was worried I was going to wear out the batteries with talking. I was like, we're just getting started, Ron. Come on.
No, sometimes it cuts out.
But the call is to accept responsibility for our choices. And not only that, but one of the most harsh accountability moments that comes in is for Moses. Moses, who had faithfully led God's people through the wilderness all this time, comes back to the point where they had been 37 years earlier and fails to obey God in his direction at Kadesh. And as a result of him not following God's instruction, is not permitted to go into the Promised Land. Right? You think about, and this is a hard reality that our sin just has natural consequences. This is something that parents are big on, right? As a parent, you talk about disciplining your kids, and we talk about natural consequences. Back in the day, natural consequences meant like if you rode your bike without your helmet, you got hurt. Like if you fell, you got hurt. But you know what? You learn to be careful. You learn to be careful. It's like, what is it? There's an element where too much protection is hurtful to you. This is a parenting bit.
Yeah.
That it shows that too much padding can be detrimental to you. Let me give an example. We have the Super Bowl coming up here very soon. I know the Lions aren't going to be there, but the Bills, as of right now, until they play against the Kansas City Chiefs tonight,
Chiefs.
and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that's gonna be a good one.
But the Buffalo Bills still have a chance there.
Fight to the finish.
It's been very it's been reported on highly, the risks and the dangers of playing American football. Right? Concussions, all kinds of injury, traumatic brain injuries, and not only that, but you have CTE. So you have all this buildup when you have repeated brain injuries, and you think about every play as a car accident where you're on the line. If you're on the offensive line or the defensive line, you're running as hard as you can into the other guy. And, physics says that when you run and you stop immediately, your brain keeps moving and just keeps bashing into the front of your head.
Yep.
Here's what we find interesting in sports where there's less padding, you have less of those kind of injuries. Isn't this interesting, right? The more padding you have, the more confidence you have in going as hard as you possibly can. Where if you have no padding, you have to restrain yourself a little bit. Not only are you restraining yourself, but the other person's restraining themselves. Because the possibility of physical injury, and I mean noticeable physical injury, not just traumatic brain injury of your brain bashing around in your head, broken bones and cracked skulls.
Just find a different way to kill them.
You don't need to worry in football. You don't need to worry with that giant helmet and those shoulder pads. You don't need to worry about your skull actually fracturing terribly. But man, if you don't have a helmet, you sure do. In fact, my dad had a skull fracture from playing a soccer match where him and another gentleman were, and this is one of those, people who are in their 30s and 40s playing, and sometimes you have people in those leagues who don't realize that everybody still needs to go to work tomorrow, and they play way too hard. This guy goes for a header and hits the ball, but also hits my dad's head and fractures his skull around his eye. You don't need to worry about that with a helmet. I don't know. Maybe this is for somebody. This will apply. But we're talking about parenting, right? And that the more padding that you provide for children, it seems often sometimes the more detrimental things can be. So natural consequences allow children to learn risk assessment. And I need to be careful because there's risk involved here. And I'm not going to just exert myself to the fullest and go as free and wild as I possibly want, but instead now I have to keep in mind, like, what are the consequences going to be of my actions? All right, we'll keep moving. That's all right. So accountability, but also faith and unbelief being contagious as being the things that are going to be big here. All right, final thing to notice, you'll notice that there are land divisions and things like that take place, and one tribe is left out. The tribe of Levi gets no land. They get no homeland to call their own. Why? Because their place was serving God. And sometimes we might be like, well, that kind of stinks. They don't get anything. Like this almost feels like a Catholic priest vow of poverty. And it's like, well, they don't get any land of their own. But think about the honor that God is saying, your place is with me. Right? This is a higher calling that God is saying, your place is with me, not in a spot east of the river. Your place is where I am. So we'll keep on moving through that. So 2 years after God brought Israel out of Egypt, he instructs Moses to number the people, to give a census. This is really the first census that we have recorded in the Bible of the Israelites, of the people. We don't get that throughout the book of Genesis or Exodus. We don't get exact numbers. We do know from the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus that the Israelites flourished, that they thrived. This seems to be the tale of Jewish people. It's almost like God's faithful to his promises or something, that wherever they go, they thrive. And sometimes this draws the ire or the jealousy or the rage and resentment of the people that they're around. Almost like it always has been. I don't know, it's almost like God's true to his word? Is that surprising to us? That when God said that he would bless them, then he does it everywhere they go. So they're thriving, and the Egyptians notice this, and they need to, the Pharaoh that says, we need to cull these people, otherwise they'll be too numerous for us, they'll be too prosperous, and they'll be able to challenge us. Right? And so, because that is the fear that the Egyptians have, that they're being too blessed, then you have a policy where all of the boys who are below the age of 2 and under are being murdered. And it's just, it's hindering, but it's not. Let me explain it this way. You can lose a generation of men, and it's not the end of the world. If you lose a generation of women, though, that's the end. That's it. That's why for almost all of human history, women were not involved in fighting wars. Because you can lose a lot of men and your civilization's going to be okay, for the most part. But man, if you lose all of your women, you think about World War I, World War II, where a generation of Europeans are just gone. Man, no, I don't know. It doesn't. We'll keep on going. I'm sorry. I'm exhausted today.
That's
All right.
That's good.
So, as the people are being numbered, one thing that I think is very interesting, and the author points this out, that they're numbered, but it's not that they're just a number. Right? And being numbered, it's not because they're just chattel. Let me say it this way. In Egypt, they were just the innumerable horde of slaves. Right? And they didn't even matter. They didn't even matter enough to get a number. But the care that God gives, right? So in the way that Skip writes it, is that it's as if when they're being counted that God's saying, I care for you, and for you, and for you, and for you. It's a showing that they're being elevated. Their status is being risen from slaves who are not cared for to the children of God who He cares for deeply. So as God gives instructions to the Israelites on how they're going to move through the wilderness and how the camp is to be organized, there are some things that are very interesting that are pointed out here that we can often miss. Sometimes we think about the Israelite camp and we might think that the shape is different than what it was. So what do I mean by that? The tabernacle was in the middle of the camp. God's presence rested there, right? So you think that for days, months, maybe a year or two, God's presence is resting at the center of the camp, and we know that it's resting in a cloud, right? So you have, amongst this, you have God's presence in a powerful display, a physical manifestation of God's presence there in the Israelite camp among them. The tabernacle is set up, and then you have Moses and his sons over to the east. You have Moses, Aaron, and his sons, and then you have the three other kind of priestly families around. But then we like to think that everybody else is just kind of in like a big circle around the tabernacle. Right? And we think of the camp, the Israelite camp, as like concentric circles that work out from God's presence in the middle. God's presence in the middle is correct, but there's not a circle forming around the tabernacle. And the instructions and the picture that's painted for us in the book of Numbers here is that the camp is divided in cardinal directions. So the camp is divided into 4 different divisions, and each division has 3 of the tribes. Okay, and each of these 4 divisions is led by one tribe specifically. So in the east you have Judah. I'm going to need to check my notes here for this one though. Ephraim to the west. Is it Reuben in the north?
Reuben in the south.
Reuben's on the south side.
You're tired.
I'm tired. Thanks, Randy. And then you have Dan on the north. And so you have these 4 divisions of the camp set across the camp in the 4 cardinal directions. Right? This is an interesting part. We'll get into this. But each division had its own banner. Each division had its own banner. And each banner had its own image, its own symbol that you could see in the camp. Anybody have a guess what the symbol was for Judah?
Lion.
A lion, right? That one's easy for us. All right. What about Dan? A judge? I feel like it's like those judgmental people in the tribe of Dan. For Dan, it was an eagle. For Ephraim, I'm appreciating also that people didn't correct me on my spelling of Reuben. I love that sandwich. I don't know why I can misspell it.
That's the symbol.
All right. So Reuben's symbol was a man, not the sandwich. That was an island dressing had yet to be invented. And then for Ephraim, the symbol was an ox.
Oh, wow.
This sounds like interesting to us, right?
Sounds like
And then there's connections. Like, I see people's brains firing right now. Because we get glimpses, there are some prophetic images and visions that take place in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation about these creatures that surround the throne of God. And in Ezekiel's vision, he describes these creatures as having the face of like a lion, a man, an ox, and an eagle.
wow.
Right? So, and these are the creatures that surround the throne of God. Here in the wandering in the wilderness with the Israelite encampment, you have the eagle, the lion, the man, the ox, surrounding God's throne, His presence, right? The tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, wasn't a idol in the sense that it was used around the area, right? For other idols, for these, engraven images, they're the images of gods. But that's not the way the Ark of the Covenant is. The Ark of the Covenant isn't an idol of God. The Ark of the Covenant is a throne for God's presence to dwell. Right? This is something that's not the norm. The temple of Zeus wasn't just a giant seat. And you'd walk in and you'd be like, well, where's Zeus? And they'd be like, this is just like his throne. That's not where... No, they would put a giant statue of the god or the goddess that they would, worship, right? These man-made structures, or at the very worst, demonic forces that have been given authority over regions. But these four divisions, these four symbols, surround God's presence, surround the throne where His presence dwells. And then we see later on in the Bible these glimpses of these creatures, these beings that represent these different divisions that also surround God's presence in His throne. It's almost like it's all connected. It's almost like God, it's almost like it was all according to plan. I don't know.
Conspiracy, that's what it is.
That's a real conspiracy for you right there. Man, it's almost like God's smarter than we are and knew it all along. Here's something also that Pastor Skip brings up that I find very interesting as well. That if you were to take a bird's eye view of the Israelite camp, because we see from the census that one of these divisions is significantly bigger than the others. Specifically Judah. Specifically the tribe of Judah is much bigger. Oh man, and I didn't leave myself enough room.
Oh, no.
My writing is off. But if you see that one side is much bigger, you don't wind up with a plus shape. You wind up instead with the shape of what? A cross.
Oh,
You end up with a cross-shaped. And you see the cross also take place in the book of Numbers with the disorganization of the Israelites receiving this plague that falls upon them. Usually, because once again they're whining, and because once again they're whining. But God, in disciplining them, gives them a glimpse of what He has in store, of what He has planned. Right? This is the way that God always disciplines His people, is that even when they get it wrong, He brings them back into the correct way of following after Him, but He often accompanies it with glimpses of what He has in store.
Thank you.
Almost like, hey, remember, this is what's ahead. This is the plan. All right? And so he brings people back into right relationship with Him, but He also gives them glimpses, these little images or pictures of what He has in store for them, what He has planned. So, moving on. He classifies the clergy. The Levites are organized by families, the families of Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. I'm sorry, I'm butchering the Hebrew pronunciation of those names. And the Gershonites are on the west. You have the Kohites to the south. And you have the sons of Merari camped to the north. Moses and Aaron and his sons are there on the east side. All right. All right, so moving on, I'm going to try to jump through here. So we're going to jump into time of disorganization. Disorganization, it unfortunately doesn't take long, right? Organization is just the first 4 chapters. And the majority, the big chunk of this book of the Bible is disorganized people who are wandering and complaining, right? It's most of us here are parents and have had the experience of dragging a child through a grocery store, right? And man, having to drag them sure makes the trip a lot longer and a lot less enjoyable. But the Israelites are almost these kids dragging their feet through the wilderness, constantly complaining, man, I wish we were back in Egypt. Why did God bring us out here for this? As they're picking up food off the ground that God provides for them. Right? Miracle after miracle every single day. Witnessing the miraculous presence of God amongst the camp. Picking up food from heaven. Man, I wish we were in Egypt.
Wow.
Just quickly forgetting. And here's the big problem that Pastor Skip identifies. We wonder, man, after the Israelites saw God's presence move in powerful ways, after they saw how God opened up the Red Sea, opened up the sea, and then brings it down to devour the people, the Egyptians who are pursuing them, and completely wash away the enemy. They're so quick, it seems, to forget. And they all were there. They all were there. All these adults who are in the Israelite assembly, they all know. They all remember. And they're all constantly experiencing it. But here's the problem: they become accustomed to it. They got used to it. The miraculous, the supernatural had just become natural.
Yeah.
And when the supernatural becomes natural, they lost a sense of the awe and the wonder and just the incredible reality that they were experiencing. And they take it for granted. And when they take it for granted, like spoiled children, they begin to complain. As they complain, and they constantly talk about going back to Egypt, a place where they were slaves. And this speaks to something that's true to the human condition. A lot of times, and Benjamin Franklin often identified this, people would rather be secure than they would rather be free. People would rather be secure, have security, than freedom. Right? We'd rather be comfortable. Maybe we can substitute security with comfort.
Sure.
Or maybe even certainty. Because at least when you're in slavery, you know that you're in slavery and you know what to expect. You know what everything's going to be in store. When you're free, everything's uncertain. That's the problem. That's the problem with freedom, that things become uncertain really quick. Because you could take so many different options. Not only that, but the road isn't paved for you. So the freedom that we have in Christ is one that is frightening. It's liberating because we're free. But in the sense it's frightening. Why? Because God has a plan for you that is specific to you, that you don't have a roadmap from anybody, because their calling wasn't your calling. There might be some similarities, some things you can glean from, but you're not going to get the 100% step-by-step following God for dummies, manual that you could have for your life specifically. That's the frightening part of it. Because there's so much freedom, and there's a lot of opportunity for me to get this wrong. And there's a lot of opportunity for things to go badly. So, the people would choose security, comfort, certainty over the uncertainty at times of following after God. Even though what God has in store for them is so much better. Far better. Once they get to Numbers chapter 13, they get right to the edge. And this could have been the last chapter. This could have been the last chapter of the book of Numbers. They get to the very edge, and they send at Kadesh out 12 spies into the promised land. Many of us are familiar with the story. They come back bringing with them all of the spoils of the land. The things that they've taken as they've surveyed the land. They've taken a look, they've seen what's there. They bring back clusters of grapes that are so big that 2 guys have to carry them. I don't know about you, but I've walked through Kroger before. I've never seen 2 people clusters of grapes. I mean, I could carry 6 other things with my cluster of grapes that I get from the store. Right? This is a place that's plentiful. Not just plentiful, but stuff that's incredible. They come back, 10 of the spies give a negative report. There are only 2 that give a good report. Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb, and Joshua's gotten some notoriety earlier in the story, but this is, Caleb's kind of a minor character at this point. And they stand up and they say, yeah, these people are big. And this is the crazy part. The 10 spies that go back, they say, we're like ants to these people because the sons of Anak were there, this giant race of mighty warrior people. Right? And they say we're like grasshoppers to them, and part of it was true. They were big. But they didn't see the Israelites as grasshoppers. How do we know that? What takes place when the Israelites finally go into the Promised Land and they go to Jericho? They meet with a prostitute named Rahab who says that our hearts have been melting with fear. Our hearts have melted with... You can imagine the people, the Canaanites who are there in the Promised Land, and they see the Israelites, and they've heard the stories of their people and what their God has done. And you have to think ancient mentality, ancient people. Wars weren't fought men against men. Wars were gods versus gods. Any war was our God versus your God. And you see this all the way through. You see this through the Odyssey, through the Trojan War. You see that this is a war against the gods. And they thought that the gods played their part in the wars, much more so than the men who were fighting did. And so they don't see the Israelites who are slaves, former slaves who have no land, no possession. They see their God, who has clearly done mighty things for them. And they look and their hearts are melting with fear, not because the Israelites are terrifying, but because their God is so powerful. Right? And so the Israelites failed to see. They're looking at the physical. They're looking at, man, these guys are big and we're going to have to fight the battle. And it seems like the Canaanites had the right perspective, that it's not just us fighting the battle, it's our God's fighting for us. And they're like, we know our gods aren't going to stand up to this one. Right? This is the cool stuff. You know what also is cool? That when Joshua goes and he's the leader, you know how many spies he sends out into Jericho? 2. He knows, he's like, you don't need 12, you just need 2 good ones. You just need 2 good guys who can go in, right? So he sends out 2 spies after they cross in to look into Jericho to get a good report there. All right, so as they go into the Promised Land, they're right on the edge. The people are swayed by the bad report of the 10. And this is even Joshua and Caleb, they stand up and they're like, no, please, come on, we can do this. They threaten to stone them to death. They threaten to stone them, and then they begin whining and complaining. And I usually, bring in the weird, almost like a combination of a Yiddish Boston accent whenever we would do this with kids. And it's like, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. And they start complaining and if only we had died in this wilderness. It'd be so much better than our children and our wives to become victims out here. Right? And so they begin complaining, and this is what's interesting, right? They say, if only, it would be better for us to die in the wilderness, and God's like, I can make that happen. Right? So Pastor Skip points out that this is kind of some cowardice. They're cowering behind their children. They're fearful that we're going to lose the battle. Our children are going to become victims of the Canaanite people. But God says this. God says, now your carcasses are going to fall in the wilderness. Everyone who is over the age of 20, who came up out of the land of Egypt, all of you will die here. Every single one of you is going to go. But your children who you are so fearful of becoming victims, they're going to be the ones who receive the inheritance. Right? They're the generation that comes in and they're going to faithfully, by trusting in me, take this land. Right? That's a powerful statement. And this number 40, as they spend 40 years wandering, 40 is a number that pops up time and time again in the Bible. It's a number that represents a season of trial, at the end of which things are no longer the same. Right? The first time we see that number 40 is in Genesis chapter 6 and 7 with the flood story. That it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. And at the end of which, things are no longer the same. Right? Jesus fasts in the wilderness for 40 days as a direct reference to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. After which the world is not going to be the same. Jesus, after he raises from the dead, do you know how many days he stayed with his disciples? 40 days. 40 days. After that time of 40 days, he ascends to heaven. The world is no longer the same. Right? So this time of 40 going through, it's a season of trial that in this trial, it purges away the things that aren't good so that at the end you're ready for the next thing. No longer burdened by the things that were holding you back in the midst of that trial. Yeah, question.
Well, I was just saying, one time I did a study on 40 and I got to die and go to seed. And I don't know if that applies or if it's right or wrong, but that's what I got.
You got to what?
To die and go to seed.
Sure. There's a principle in there, right? The principle, and this is what Jesus said, that unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it can't produce anything. I think that's a good image. I think it's a good image for the principle that is repeated throughout the number 40 throughout the Bible. I like to think of it as a purification, right? A process of taking the raw material and melting it down, removing all the impurities, so then at the end of it, you're left with something that is pure and valuable and useful. But we'll move on. All right, so we'll kind of end with Moses' problem. We're skipping